Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new masterclass. I hope everyone is well. Sorry, we started a couple of minutes late to let everyone join. I know this is around lunchtime, so hope you have everything with you. Let me introduce you, if you don't know her already, our speaker is Araujo. Anna is specialized in conservation buildings, in existing buildings in relation to diagnostic and intervention. And she's also our group lead, our facade engineering group lead. Today, Anna will give us a very interesting class, which fundamentally focuses on how we can how can we apply key sustainability criteria to existing buildings, heritage and protecting buildings in a logic and sympathetic way. So what she'll do is identify the key criteria from a sustainability point of view, identify the principles associated to conservation on buildings, and then give you very interesting examples on how these can be implemented have been actually implemented on our projects. So, and I hope this presentation is good enough, and then I'll leave the microphone.
No, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate your time. This is a topic that we received a number of requests, so I tried to prepare a presentation that responds to the requests that we received. The title of my presentation is Advising and Designing Facades for Multiple Cycles, really thinking about longevity and renewal and durability, and the importance of understanding the facade fabric life cycle. I'll just make here a brief summary of today's session. I'm aiming to discuss the importance of upgrading existing building fabric and the skills that we need to bring to the table. I will start by presenting very briefly the sustainability drivers behind this. I will introduce you to important conservation principles that should be in the back of our mind when we work on our projects. I will talk about the importance of understanding the existing facade fabric, investigation and design strategies to mitigate risk. This is quite important, probably something that really is in the back of your mind every time you have a project that involves existing fabric. And then we will go through case studies that hopefully demonstrate the lead that heritage or protected buildings can have in low embodied carbon solutions. They really are ahead. So starting with the drivers, I want to start by just setting the scene and the mood for this presentation, why this topic is so important. We all know that we are in a climate crisis. These are just some numbers that help us understand the impact that we have in the construction industry. I hope to transmit this in an uplifting and empowering way, because we can indeed make a difference. And it is important that we apply the principles that I will talk about in our day-to-day projects. You can see here, for example, that the construction industry has an impact assessed in 11% of the global energy-related CO2 emissions. The existing buildings, in particular, the way that they consume energy, etc., have an impact of 28%. So this talk today, it's all about trying to improve the fabric that falls within those 28% without increasing too much the impact of the construction of bringing new materials. The current analysis of embodied carbon calculations for facades for a typical building confirms that the use of new materials is the biggest contributor for embodied carbon at all stages of a project. So, an easy win is to reduce the use of new, use existing for longer, and if possible, recycle and reincorporate materials that were already there. We need to design facades and refurbish facades for multiple cycles. This photograph that you can see here is a bit of an extreme example, but shows how we can be inventive in thinking about how to reuse materials in buildings. Very briefly, a reminder of the principles of a circular economy. I won't dwell too much on this because we already had a specific masterclass just on the topic of facades and sustainability, where we really dig into these 4 steps and principles. But just to keep in the back of your mind, we should use less new. We should use new responsibly, thinking about how we detail and design for disassembly, for example. We should use for longer, which becomes tricky when we associate facade materials that have different durabilities. And if possible, we should use again. I want to also commence by introducing the conservation principles, because in my opinion, we should be applying them to all refurbishment projects, even those that do not include a building that is listed. Historic England's policy and guidance on conservation principles is quite relevant for what we're going to talk about today. I will not go into too much detail. I think I really recommend reading the complete document. It really is quite interesting. But without wanting to get too philosophical in a technical presentation, I don't think that these principles were necessarily written with a sustainability focus, but I think that with what we know now, we can give a new layer to the protection of existing fabric and materials. So going through the principles, the historic environment is a shared resource. Principle 2, everyone should be able to participate in sustaining the historic environment. Understanding the significance of places is vital. Significant places should be managed to sustain their values. Decisions about change must be reasonable, transparent, and consistent. And it is important to document and learn from decisions. I want to give some space here for the guidance on how to manage changes to significant places. Again, this is all part of the Historic England document. Please keep these bullet points in mind as we go through the presentation. We should establish whether there is sufficient information before we even start looking at options. We should consider the effects on authenticity or integrity. We should take into account sustainability of values for appreciation by future generations. We should consider the potential reversibility of changes. This is quite important. We should compare options and make decisions. We should apply mitigation to negative effects. So when we make changes, will it have an impact on the fabric that was already there? And we should monitor and evaluate the outcomes. So some of you asked about how we should establish conversation with, for example, the planning authorities, the conservation officer. This is what will be in the back of their mind. They expect the project team, the designers, the project managers, to demonstrate that there was a considerate approach, that information was gathered, that options were analyzed, and there is a reason why a specific option was chosen, and that option will not have a detrimental effect in the fabric that was already there. So moving on to the importance of the analysis and understanding of existing fabric. Again, in my perspective, this is an area where our industry is lacking a bit at the moment. If we go back to that pie chart and the big built environment and the big building stock that we need to have an impact on, we really need a vast number of professionals qualified to look at existing fabric in all areas, from architects to consultants to project managers. We really need to upskill the industry. Going back to the conservation principles, to be able to make an informed decision on the best option for the intervention on a facade, we need to be able to understand how it was built, what's the life that is left in each component, how materials look like when they fail, how do they look like after 5, 10, 15 years. And sometimes we struggle to obtain this information, especially from material suppliers. I know that I'm always challenging material suppliers to test their products and show me the data of how the material weathers. Sometimes they want to convince us that material is perfect, and it's not supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to weather like all of us. And we need to know how that happens and when it's time to be replaced. Also, please bear in mind that a refurbishment project can assume all shapes and briefs. An existing building might be listed, it might not be listed or protected. The right decision for that particular project might be a minimum intervention, a medium intervention, an extensive intervention. But we need to properly assess the facade to be able to help the client reach the right conclusion. As an example, we can start with a building like this. This building belonged to St. Bart's Hospital in London. This was a project that we developed with Helical and Shepherd Robson. And the aspiration of the client was to change the use of the existing building, really regenerate the area, change to a residential use, extend the building while keeping the original facade features. In this case, the facades were retained, the windows were replaced, but the overall performance of the facade had to be improved for that residential use. And it is possible, but it's impossible, we need to assess the impact that the new use will have on the fabric. As a completely different example, we can start with a building like this. This is Appleton Tower in Edinburgh. It's an educational building that belongs to the university. We got involved when the university noted that the facade was deteriorating, probably creating some safety risks of bits of cladding falling from height. They were concerned. So we were called just to help diagnose the issues with the facade. And through that conversation and analysis, we reached the conclusion with the client that the best option for this particular case would be a replacement of 70% of the facade areas, because it would be the only way to really address the safety issues, to improve the performance, and to extend the life cycle of the building. So you can see here the end result with the new curtain wall system provided. The client took the opportunity to redefine the use of the building, to improve the performance, to reduce operational carbon and costs, and, for example, to create a new floor that you can see here that gives more flexibility to the building use. On our side, we took the opportunity to introduce, for example, photovoltaic panels in the facade. You can see on the right-hand side in the tower how they were integrated in a sympathetic way. So these two examples show how we can do a minimum, medium, or a large intervention, and each case will need to be analyzed for its merits. But again, this optioneering is only possible when we deeply assess how the fabric is performing and how far in the life cycle each component is. And this should be done in a measured way. There are ways to measure, to assess. It should not just be a guess. There are ways to do a more informed decision. Before we move to the case studies, I want to elaborate a bit on the investigation and design strategies when we are working on refurbishment projects. Because, as we already established, in a refurbishment project, we start with a building full of unknowns, and we need to start bridging the gap of those unknowns and understanding the fabric. There is always an element of fear that comes with an existing construction that translates as risk to the planning process, to the budget, to the program. One important thing to note is that when we're talking about a big development that has just the component that is a refurbishment, specifically if that building is listed, it will have a massive impact, that specific building, on the overall program of the development. So it's important that we look carefully and at that refurbishment to make sure that all the rest can progress. But there are ways to manage this risk. One way is to conduct thorough research. It's important to establish a strategy for surveys that enable us to, again, reduce the unknowns. We should have informal discussions with planning authorities from very early stages to really understand what's important for them. We should bring early input from specialist contractors. And we should develop design intent and performance specifications. This is quite important. Again, keeping in mind that refurbishments have their own program and procurement approach. What we shouldn't do is wait for the final contractor to conduct the investigations, to define the scope of works that are needed, the level of quality that we should try to achieve, and the program. It doesn't mean that it's impossible that way, but if we go down that route, we haven't managed it. We haven't managed the risk from early stages, and the client will be more exposed. I want to just develop a little bit more on these three parts in particular, just give you some project examples that help illustrate. In terms of the thorough research, we need to start by thinking, is there a special interest in this building? Is it listed? Is it in a conservation area? A quick way to just understand this is to do a search in the Historic England website. We might not know that the building is listed, but it might be part of the curtilage of a listed building. So it's important to just double check as a start from the very beginning. This is just an example of what the results looks like in the Historic England website. This is what we ended up as a result when we did our research for the Grade 2 listed whitelist building in Bayswater. Then think about what other information you can obtain from AJ articles, in the RIBA archive, local authority records. There are records of recent interventions that might be with other consultants or contractors. I just want to show you the quality and importance of some of the information we might end up with. It really helps the design team. So this is, for example, for Whitelist, a photograph of the day of the opening that gives really important information of what was the original aesthetic and construction. Another example, what I would note is that, for example, when we visited the building for the first time about 8 years ago, when we got there, the windows that you see on the second and third floor were painted white. And this photograph from the date of opening allows us to understand that the original intent was to have dark windows, for example. It also enabled us to see that the shop fronts that we could see in our site visit were not original. So kind of thinking about what the planners might value, they are more likely to value original fabric than an 80s intervention that is really not in keep with the aesthetics. We found structural drawings that really showed embedded steel structure. Imagine the amount of time and money that we saved in intrusive investigations just by finding this article from the time of construction. Really valuable. This is just an example of the detailing of the cornice level that we were able to find and to see, help us identify where the embedded structure is located. We found articles from the 80s intervention in the building, really showing that part of the facade had already been retained and how and up to where. Super valuable information. And then obviously, after all this research, we visited site. It's really powerful for those initial impressions. We can look for dating clues, possible evolution of the facades throughout the years, any alterations that were made in relation to the original. And that helps to shape the brief of the intervention with the architect, with the client, and to inform those initial conversations with the planning authorities so that they understand our thinking process and the analysis that we're making of the fabric. Be careful with false clues. Existing buildings are full of false clues. So for example, this clock was in the facade of Whiteley's and provides this date of 1863. Through our research, we knew that actually the building opened in 1912. So we were covered, but for some buildings, you might not find that. So you always need to be a bit skeptical with what you see and question. In this case, it's just because Mr. Whiteley liked this clock and brought it from a previous building that he owned. We also had the benefit of a foundation stone that clarified that it was laid in 1910. So in this case, we found other clues. Moving on in terms of strategy, once you conduct your survey, you visit site, you need to start listing those unknowns and things that you really need to know to be able to progress the design and the strategy. So you need to start thinking about the surveys that help you achieve the information. It can be a condition survey of the existing windows. So for example, if the windows are an important aspect for the planners, the planners don't know the building in detail, obviously. So it's the job of the team to really provide information to substantiate decisions. In this case, it was important to conduct a detailed survey of all components of the windows, what was their condition. And that helped us understand that maybe only 5% of the handles or spanglets or stays were actually original. So that completely changes the type of conversation that we need to have with the planning authorities and the decisions we need to make in terms of the refurbishment options. It might be an assessment and a condition survey of the opaque areas of the limestone, starting to really map any defects that we see, try to identify trends, try to compare with defects we find on the inside of the building. For example, and you almost tie the mapping in an elevation with photographs, but then bearing in mind what we know about the embedded structure in these facades, we might need to do some intrusive investigations targeted to try to see if there is a particular issue that needs to be addressed. And think about other surveys you might need, whether it is to identify the strength of materials, paint metal analysis, in this case, measured surveys, because some structural interventions might be needed. So you need to establish what's there as a start to be able to design the alterations, laboratory testing to determine the material performance. Think about other surveys, and each project will have its own unknowns. Think about, for example, if you need surveys for BREEAM compliance, moisture surveys, any other conditions, if the building is listed in the listed building consent that you might need to conduct. And the good news is that you don't need to do it alone. There is a huge database of specialist consultants and contractors that can help. There are many registers available, so it's just a matter of really finding the right support. Moving on to the point about developing design intent and performance specifications, the main point that I want to pass across is that we shouldn't be prescriptive with existing buildings. I know that it might almost feel that we are giving an unfinished design to the clients, but it really is counterproductive to measure everything and prepare a pack for tender that it's extremely detailed when we know for sure that when the contractor will remove the windows, they will have to measure each single case so before going to production. So we need to be purposefully vague. So we just need to be able to communicate very well what's existing, what needs to be altered, what should be new, and what needs to be demolished, so that they understand the principle and they can price accordingly, and they can price for the surveys that they still need to conduct during construction. Just another example of detailing that is vague on purpose, so that the contractor understands where are the limits of knowledge and what surveys still need to be conducted when everything is stripped out. A very important aspect with refurbishment projects is that we are changing the fabric, and this brings condensation risk. Historic buildings are extremely breathable, so by including high-performing layers such as new windows, thermal insulation, VCLs, we are introducing risk of thermal bridges and condensation. So we need to be able to run condensation risk analysis that help us properly understand the impact of the changes and then detail correctly the alterations. This is an example that is included in my case study, so I won't delve too much into it, but you'll be able to see that the important thing is to, where we're making alterations to existing fabric, run an analysis and then use that to inform the detailing. With existing fabric, we never know how it will react, for example, for cleaning. So we need to specify the repair and material samples that we expect to see. And again, if the building is protected or listed, probably the planners will want to see too. So it's important that the contractor can price and allow in the program for this. And then think about interim stages. You can see, for example, here in the example of Whiteley's, the southern cupola that had to be dismantled to allow the retention of the facade and the erection of the new structure. So that early engagement with the specialist contractors enabled us to understand that they needed a very specific type of scaffold, a mason scaffold, to be able to deconstruct and then construct the cupola. And that had to be carefully coordinated with the temporary retention structure. You can see in the right-hand side photograph how the retention structure started coming from the sides, and that corner was left without it for a while, so that the mason scaffold could be built and removed. So this has an impact on the program. And again, everything needs to be planned in advance so that then there isn't an issue with budget and program. And then just think about any listed building consent conditions that you might need to pass on into the performance specifications so that the contractor can properly pick up and discharge. And more than anything, again, don't be prescriptive. There are too many unknowns. So going into the case studies, what I'm really hoping to give you here are just a couple of examples of sympathetic refurbishments and how I feel that interventions in heritage and protected buildings have a lead in low embodied carbon solutions. And the main reason for me is that with protected buildings, we need to justify what needs to be altered and removed, not what can be reused. So when we go into a building, our immediate thinking is not let's replace this, because everything we need to replace, we need to justify. And we also need to justify that any changes will not harm existing fabric. The first example that I want to talk to you about is the Institute of Education, part of UCL in London, a 70s building, the refurbishment. We worked with Hawkins Brown. Important things to know: it's a grade 2-star listed building, and part of what we started to do again was that research and looking at O&M manuals to try to obtain as-built information that is quite valuable. We then conducted an initial condition survey to compare with the as-built information. We assessed the condition of different components of the facade, and we carried out a thermographic survey to really evaluate the existing fabric performance. In the infrared images, you can see areas shown as red generally illustrate the areas of highest heat loss, and areas shown as blue-green generally mean that the fabric is performing better. And some of the key findings you can immediately notice is that the heat losses in the Institute of Education are much higher than the adjacent buildings that actually are of older construction. The heat losses through the windows and window frames were significant, which means that the seals or the window frames had an opportunity to be improved as part of the refurbishment, and also that generally the spandrel panels perform marginally better than the actual windows. We presented various options to the client, from a de minimum to a medium to an extensive intervention, and with the pros and cons of each. A medium intervention was selected, as you can see here in this detailing. It basically goes through the upgrading of the thermal fabric performance. So a secondary glazing was added. The original glazing was improved in terms of seals. The coatings were repaired to extend the life of those systems. And then we also included insulation in spandrel panels. So the facade optimization aimed to maintain the character of the existing facade, really extending its life cycle and durability, and then adding reversible interventions behind that improve the performance. It should be noted that we were able to meet the minimum Part L 2B requirement of a U value of 1.8. One important aspect is that we worked with our sustainability team to help the client prioritize interventions, which areas of the facade would benefit the most from the improvement, and we mapped that out for the client in a graphical way so that they could understand. We also thought about passive measures to avoid over-specification. If you know this building, you know that it faces a very busy road. So we worked with the architects and the acoustic consultant to try to move noise-sensitive rooms to the elevations that are less exposed to noise pollution. These had a massive contribution to the comfort of users and the avoidance of more onerous and carbon-heavy glazing improvements. Our sustainability team was able to compare the impact of the intervention in energy consumption, and we can see that even with the sensible approach, trying to maintain most of the fabric like we did, the impact is considerable. And going back to the point of monitoring and measuring the impact of intervention, we then carried out a post-intervention thermography, and we could see the benefits of the alteration. In this building, our sustainability team also conducted a very interesting questionnaire to the users before and after the intervention, focused on comfort and productivity, and it actually enabled to measure the increase in revenue that the university would have from the improvement of the fabric. So this is quite interesting because this building dedicates to paid research, so the users are researchers, and their increase in productivity means more revenue for the university. And this is part of a sustainability measure because we should keep the buildings relevant and in use. Moving on, I'm mindful of time. So we have here a second example, which is the grade 2 listed Warmington House. It's part of the big Tottenham experience intervention. One thing to note is that it's one of the best kept examples of Georgian architecture, and it was part of the Heritage at Risk register. So you can see how it looks now with the Tottenham Experience building encapsulating 3 sites. This is a project we developed with Populous and F3 architects. This is what the building looked like when we first visited a few years ago. You would never say that this was a gem that deserves to be preserved. But we conducted a condition survey and an analysis of the fabric. And for example, we focused on the assessment of the performance of the windows in that main elevation that was not to be encapsulated, and how we could liaise with our colleagues in the MEP team to establish what internal temperature and moisture conditions we had to have to minimize impact to the fabric with the new use, because the building is now used as part of the club's store and museum. So we built a model after our survey of the windows, the sash, the timber sashes that were there. We assessed the performance in different temperatures and relative humidity conditions. We tried, because we measured the rebate of the sash windows, to include very slim DGUs and try to understand if that would have an impact and reduce the condensation risk. And we were able to present in a very simple table version the results. And by a combination of introducing a very slim DGU and altering and adjusting the internal environmental conditions, we could actually minimize the condensation risk in those windows and make sure that that fabric would last and that the intervention would not have a detrimental effect on the historic fabric. The same was done for the roof. If you think about that original image, the building is now encapsulated on 3 sides by a very modern construction. We developed a model of the materials that were there. You can see on the right bottom image the new glazing that is now coming and abutting the facade and the roof with high performance, changing the thermal line of the building. So again, we simulated the performance. We did some condensation risk analysis, and we helped the architect detail, as I showed before, the how the various layers should be positioned, for example, the VCL. And again, let's think about how we detail and how we provide access. If you think about the timber roof structure and the roof tiles, if we introduce a VCL, we're introducing a material that has a completely different durability. So we need to detail it in a way that it can be replaced without having to change the complete roof. And we need to start having these factors in mind when we develop the design. This is what it looks like. If you think about the image of the building before, it's quite striking. The interior photographs are also amazing. I almost would leave here a recommendation to go to the F3 Architects website just to look at this amazing building. And the main point is that most of the engineering was done to minimize intervention, but it needs good coordination with all consultants. That was it from me. I'll just need to leave here a slide with what I hope I was able to pass to you today, that we should apply conservation principles to all refurbishment projects, not just the ones that are protected or listed. We should conduct research and develop a strategy for surveys to eliminate the unknowns. We should bring specialists that understand the fabric, the life cycle of each component, and that can assess the actual performance. We should conduct an option analysis. A balanced, reduced approach might be sufficient to reach the client's objectives. We really should try to avoid overscoping and overspecifying. And this, especially for listed buildings, the conservation officer or the planning authority will want to see evidence that we're following this process. A balanced intervention is only possible with close multidiscipline collaboration. And again, try not to be prescriptive, work with specialist contractors from early stages. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening. It was a big monologue. I hope you have some questions and we can discuss